Hey there, welcome to Smokin' Science, the podcast put on by our team at Smokin' All, where two pharmaceutical scientists break down the research of cannabis and other natural products and how you can use this information in your everyday lives. I'm Miyabi.
And I'm Riley.
A quick update. Thank you everyone who has tried our Profound Naturals Hemp Smokin' All limited release. We've gotten some really good feedback from people saying that it works better than anything they've ever tried.
We wish we could tell you more about what exactly it has helped people with, but we're not allowed to make any claims per FDA guidelines. So you'll just have to try it yourself.
I'm super stoked because we're going to be making topicals soon. So head on over to www.profoundnaturals.com.
We'll throw the link in the bio. All right, let's get started.
We both have our PhDs studying drug discovery, but we both feel very strongly that you absolutely do not need a degree to be a scientist. There are many different ways to get into this industry, and having unique experiences leads to unique perspectives, products, and it's our opinion that diversity always leads to community growth.
Today we have a special guest, Murphy Murri. Murphy wears many hats in the cannabis industry. She currently runs the research and development at Sano Gardens. She founded Hash Fight, an educational tool to debunk and demystify some claims made in the cannabis industry, and continues to work on outreach and education in the cannabis space. We're so excited to have her on the podcast, so let's get started.
Let's do it. Welcome to Smokin' Science. Nothing but the facts about our favorite plant. So one of the most common questions we get is how to get into the industry. How do you become a cannabis scientist and how do you start working in a cannabis lab? And all of us have different journeys, but Murphy, would you share with us like your journey?
Yeah, I got into the industry really early in the cannabis evolution. So I entered the industry in 2009, and I don't think you could really call it an industry then. We were, operating under the guise of caregivers. And so that meant a lot more, accessible opportunities at the time, in part because there wasn't licensing, so costs were lower. So to be someone with no experience at the time almost meant finding someone to trust you. So it was very much the intern sort of format. You were literally working for free. It was go help someone trim, to talk to them about growing, and they find out you're not a weirdo and they like you enough to keep you around. And then they have you start helping them, transplant. And then from there, you start helping them clone. And it's like this progression of just working your way through the door, which is very much like the internship process. It just didn't come with that title or that formal flow chart that indicated to you that you would get paid at some point at the end, which maybe some internships are still that way too, where they don't quite give you that kind of job opportunity at the end. But that's how a lot of people got started. And in 2009, when I was getting involved, that was still very much the protocol. It was either be a grower, have assets, have a space, have lab equipment, have experience already from an illegal opportunity that you created for yourself, or find someone and work for free, and sometimes that meant finding a mentor who helped grow you into a great, competent person. Sometimes that meant getting burned repeatedly.
I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge how far we've come as an industry and how much it's evolved, but also that we are still in our infancy. We are still in the federal prohibition, and this industry has so much more to grow and expand, and I'm really excited for it. I'm grateful to be able to be a part of it, and I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge it, to acknowledge everyone who's come before me and done things before us in different ways, and I appreciate all of it, and I appreciate all of the people who are working together towards building this community and going somewhere great in the future together.
I was able to meet some really good people early on. Part of that came from just being a cannabis consumer and a picky one myself. So I knew people who were growing good weed. So I met some really great people, and I started out under that caregiver model. We opened a dispensary first, and I got to learn the genetics and the products from the retail level first, because we were just buying from caregivers and then reselling to patients. So it was like the coolest entry to the industry because I got to meet all the people producing it, talk to them about their products and processes, become an expert on judging whether or not they were worth buying, turn around and sell them to patients who gave me direct feedback about it, which I then got to turn around and give directly to the person who was making that hash or growing that weed. And so in 2010, I got to start extracting. I started working under Nicotine Essential Extracts, who is like still world famous for solventless production. He coined the term solventless. And so he was the first person to ever teach me to make hash commercially. And we made bubble hash, and we made it on like paper plates with fans, and like in a little plastic washer, and like we've come a long way from the first few rounds that we did. But even though the products look totally different, what I love about my entry to the industry is that almost all of the people that I joined this industry with well over 10 years ago now are still around, and they're still in this industry. So I got very lucky to meet some very good people early on.
Well, it's not all luck too. You're a very personable person. Like, people definitely love talking to you, and that definitely helps. And as you said, I mean, you've been using cannabis for a very long time, and you represent that culture too, which when you walk into a dispensary and you're kind of like, hey, can I do something here? That's kind of what they're taking for face value is, I use a lot of cannabis and I'm interested in working in this space. And I'm sure that leveraged your potential a lot more to them. And it gives you such a unique perspective that you started essentially with patients first, with the caregiver perspective. And then you kind of just built over time, diversifying and learning these different sectors of the cannabis industry, which is a very unique perspective. I don't know anyone else who's worked in that many different portions of it.
You've seen it evolve into, like, from starting off where it was. I mean, like, from my perspective as a patient, I was a medical patient in California before there was like a quantification of, before the lab testing had like percentages of THC and cannabinoids. And even just as a patient watching that evolve, I can't imagine, being on the inside. And something that you mentioned that I just wanted to point out that I think is something that's important for people who do want to get into the industry and are searching for that and searching for other people, is that being passionate about cannabis and being passionate about it as a consumer, as like I consider myself a patient. I think that finding other people who have that, while the industry is growing, and so that means that not everybody who's in the industry is a consumer anymore. It's a little bit different. I think that, like, the culture of these places, kind of like what you were saying about getting lucky, it's about this culture that you found and the people that you found who care. And I think that's something that Riley and I talk about all the time, and Andy, and at our company. Like, we are, like, if we were not consumers, then I don't know why we would care so much about quality and about moving things forward.
And education, like making people appreciate all the unique things that cannabis has that many other plants and natural products don't, how it interacts with your body.
Right. And so it's like you gotta love cannabis.
Yeah. And really there's a big, kind of divide between the old traditional market and the new, legal market. And it has flattened out a little bit as the industry has swallowed up a lot of us. And, a lot of states have created an infrastructure that makes it hard to be a small business anymore. But ultimately, the core of that argument was always that if you were involved in cannabis before it was legal, you did it because you loved it. Because if we're just talking about doing illegal things for money, lots of illegal things are more profitable than cannabis. Cannabis takes a long time. It's very smelly. Takes forever to car. You know what I mean? Like, everything about it is higher risk than the other alternatives. If we're just thinking about it like drug dealers, even people who were cannabis drug dealers back then did it because they were very passionate about the plant. And so, their issue with the new legalized market has always been that they want people who are as passionate as them. And I don't think that the risk is what made them passionate. It just was the thing that filtered out people without passion. Because if you weren't passionate, you would have moved on to a different, product. You would have moved on in a different way. Cannabis has this opportunity to really, change how we shape our culture. And instead of dividing each other based on, like, whether I'm classically trained through academia or classically trained through the fields of NorCal shouldn't matter as much as, do you really, really love cannabis? Because the rest of it is just a job, and kind of a hard one, and harder than regular jobs in a lot of ways. So you kind of really need to love cannabis. If you don't, you might take an easier road than the
Right.
one we're all going down.
Notoriously difficult molecules to work with.
Right.
Just like cannabinoids are sticky, and like speaking about like trimming and like getting everything on your hand. And but another thing I really wanted to say, and I think I want to know what Riley thinks about this too, is that basically describing like an apprenticeship, right? Like we were talking about like internship, like an apprenticeship of like being directly underneath someone and like learning the trades or the skills. That is actually the original model for science.
Right.
That is the model of academia. And so we won't go too
Peer-reviewed
down
research, right? We got to teach each other to check each other.
right, and we don't have to go too long down this road. But I wanted to hear what you thought, Riley, about about apprenticeship in science, and about like academia apprenticeship, and like just how we learned.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a lot more valuable if more people learn through the apprenticeship workflows, because you're seeing someone do something, they can talk you through like, hey, I messed up on this. This is how I'm going to fix this problem, which is something you can't read in a textbook, you don't read in peer review. Learning from someone and seeing the way even the way they move their body when they're handling complex systems, even simple things like that, you really can't learn from just reading what other people have done. Physically seeing someone and someone telling you, having a mentor that you can approach and ask complicated questions to, and have that back and forth, I think is extremely valuable in any industry, specifically cannabis too. And Murphy, I had one more question about mentorship as well. For anyone listening, again, who wants to get into the industry, where did you found your mentors? Mostly in dispensaries, or kind of working through different people, or where would you recommend people start who want to work in the cannabis industry?
So I would say that like the easiest way to get started is find people who are excited about the same things you are. And so with social media, that's way more accessible than ever before. So you can start just by like messaging Instagram accounts. If you see a dispensary and the content, the captions of their posts resonate with you because they talk about full spectrum a lot and you're passionate about that, or they talk about lab testing a lot and you're passionate about that, or they talk about exclusive genetics a lot and you're passionate about that, find people who are saying things you already agree with and get involved with them.
I love that. And be annoying. That's one thing I always tell people is like, be annoying. If I don't answer your email, hit me up again, because maybe I just forgot about it. But like,
here's the thing, we won't know. Like, we'll have read 2 or 3 emails, and the one that finally gets through, it will have forgotten the other ones. You're not annoying us because we don't remember.
Right. Only
I was just gonna say that.
Only like you think you're annoying. Everyone else is just like, oh, thank you.
We're the ones who are embarrassed that we have read an email and forgotten it. You know, you don't have to be self-conscious about it, because that also shows me some hustle, right? Because while it's easy for me to say, oh, well, this guy could sit and Instagram message everyone. If he's going to Instagram message me something thoughtful every time we post something that he agrees with, and constantly reminds me that he's available and ready to do any kind of work, and be prepared to, offer up yourself at that internship level. I don't necessarily mean work for free, although there are plenty of people who would definitely take in an intern for experience. But like, be willing to take an entry level job to get the, resume credits that you need to work towards the job you want. Because if you're not in the industry yet, it's not what it looks like, probably. Like the stuff that we post on Instagram is the nicest part of the day.
That's true. Like, I wash a lot of dishes. There's a lot of dishes
and
going on.
Some of them you wash and then they're not clean, and you're like, I'm just going to come back to that tomorrow. Like, this isn't even getting done. There's a lot of the job that is just a job. And a lot of people don't recognize kind of what it looks like. So like, a lot of people want to be in an R&D lab, but they apply for jobs that are high volume production, and they're going to be miserable because there's no time for friendly conversations in a high volume production lab. If you don't like wearing a tight form-fitting ventilator on your face all day, some of these jobs are not the job that you want. You might think you want to do really cool hexane chromatography until you find out that you're in a suit all day, and it's pretty uncomfortable. And it's a lot of note taking and a lot of data. And so like a lot of people have an idea of like just wanting to work with cannabis, but there's a lot of ways to work with cannabis. Some of it is physically handling the plant. And the only people who say I love trimming are people who haven't done it for very long, because it's a hard job too. It's like, you get that terpene rash sometimes. And so like, you've got to think about what kind of job you actually want. And the best way to learn that is to see what that job looks like, because there's a short part of the day where the short path is doing the cool thing that looks cool. And the rest of my day is cleaning it again, putting it together. Now we got to wait. Oh, that didn't work. Now we got to start over. It's like a lot of these steps that are just very, very much labor and job oriented. And if you want to be talking with people all day, you probably don't actually want to be in the lab. Maybe you want to be a salesperson for a lab so that you can see the lab and talk to the guys at the lab, and then get out of there when those vacuum pumps all up and everything gets noisy again.
That's a great point. And maybe that's the place where these like unpaid kind of apprenticeships, internships, maybe that's a good place of just following someone around for a week or two, just seeing if it's something that you want to dedicate that time and energy to pursuing. And if you say, oh my gosh, I do not want to wear a face covering all day and work with these volatile, dangerous chemicals, then maybe I try a different thing and I go shadow someone else and see if that's more compatible with my lifestyle. And I think that's a good place for unpaid work. I mean, it'd be better if you got paid, but what can you do?
Everything is better if you're getting paid. But I mean, just to double down on the whole, like, you don't know the soup until you're swimming in it type of a thing. Also, many cannabis companies in the industry, I mean, like, we are not strapped up like the pharma companies are, where there's like someone is, replacing pipette tips, and like, in many of our operations in the cannabis industry, you're going to end up doing a lot of things that aren't kind of like, you can't afford to do otherwise, because the cannabis industry, while it's amazing that it's legalized and that it's becoming more legalized, we should legalize it everywhere. While there's more access, there's a lot of laws that like taxes and just like other costs to the industry that keep that barrier really, really high, and that make it so that the labs are really kind of like, they're not minimally funded. It's just that the labs are very, very expensive. And so like certain things like doing the dishes and like, replacing pipette tips and like little things that are jobs that you have to love what you're doing to do it. And I think definitely getting in there and figuring out what you actually physically want to do every day is important. And that's something that I think is true for academia too. Like, really quickly, just looking at the other side of getting into the cannabis industry, which was like for Riley and I through academic research routes. um, it's the same way, where it's very glamorized to go do research in academia and, publish peer reviewed papers, and then, you know, get your PhD, and it's glamorized in a way that you don't see the fact that it's a huge struggle for a majority of people too. And that I think it's no route is going to be, in my opinion, I don't think any route is better than the other, because at the end of the day, you're applying the skill set of your experience that in the best way possible in an industry that is in its infancy and has like an infinite amount of space to grow and expand to better suit the patients and the consumers who are using it.
And I think it's great to have people of all different backgrounds, because it's just shifting the perspective everywhere. If we're working together specifically, we can really be innovative. We can have greener processes, like more eco-friendly. Just we can make the changes we want to see by interacting with each other, talking about what our methods are, how we can improve it, even troubleshooting. If we can all work together, I think it's a lot more beneficial to have people from all different backgrounds rather than everyone from the exact same trajectory in life. That's not really useful in any industry.
Right. And I think, as someone coming from, the workplace experience first and looking at academia, what's notably different is that a lot of times, everyone who comes to cannabis from the traditional market first comes to it with not just the understanding, but like the complete blinded dedication to, I am gonna do everything. And that's crazy. That's a huge undertaking. Academia, on the other hand, is nothing but extremely specialized. Like, you guys both studied cannabis to get a PhD, and you didn't study the same things. Someone on my side of the fence is going to say, oh, everything that Miyabi understands, Riley understands, because they studied cannabis and their PhDs. So like, it's kind of like how we think a doctor knows everything, like about everything. It's like, that's crazy.
Right. But they're just like Googling symptoms when you turn.
Yeah. And so the reason that academia can become so specialized is because there's inherent understanding that if I specialize, then when I have a question outside of my specialty, I go to someone else who specializes. Whereas the cannabis mindset has always been like, it has to all be me. If I didn't do it all, if it's not single source until I'm exhausted and out of money, then then it wasn't good enough. But like, it is okay to get really good at one part of this process and let other people thrive in the area that they are great at and contribute. That teamwork aspect is a culture shift that I think academia could help us with, because it is so valuable to be very good at something, and you can't be very good at all of them.
Yes, I totally agree. And speaking of specialties, do you want to kind of dive into what you specialize in making for cannabis products? Because I think people would be very interested in learning more.
Sure. So I have followed the bad example, did the thing I just said not to do, and done a little bit of everything in my career. And like I said, a lot of that came from forced vertical integration. And so, the government said you have to do it all to do any. And so we did our best. And what that did give me was that, really hands-on experience of figuring out which parts of the job are not for me. For example, plants grow very slowly. And I am an impatient person. So I love the lab because the lab is instant. I can have an idea, I can try an idea, I can see if it worked or not today, and then try it again tomorrow. And so I got into the lab really pretty quickly after that vertical integration shift, moved away from retail. And I started with that like solventless, that bubble hash product, especially because that was the primary product on the market. But and I had an edible company. So we were doing like ethanol, like that RSO style full spectrum hash at the time too. This was pre-testing. So it was regular strength and triple strength based on a popular vote.
That's crazy. So you had no tools of actually figuring out like how much THC.
So I weighed the hash that I made and put the same amount in, make the edibles, just make them. And then we all eat one and we see if it's the same or more.
Can I ask you a question that I've just been thinking about a lot since what do you think about testing for THC percentage? I understand that it's incredibly valuable, but something that I've just noticed about like having the percentage of THC I think it's great that we can do it and quantify it. I think that's amazing. But for me personally, I kind of miss the days when it was like highs, mids, and lows. Like I do kind of miss that. And I did feel like perhaps it affects the quality sometimes because people are going for THC.
Not only that, think about the placebo effect that it has on you.
Great point.
So my opinion there is that we have to give people some data, right? Like that's all we're trying to do. We want classification. Every human craves a category. We want to say safe, unsafe, good, bad, like we want everything to be easy in that way. And so, a lot of people within the industry say THC isn't the most important thing. We know that terpenes are important. We think that flavonoids are relevant. but then we only test for THC. So if that's the only thing we test for, we have to put that on the label because the customer wants something. If terpenes are important, put terpenes on the label. Give them another piece of information, you know? So the reason that it's potency is because it's modeled after alcohol. What if we modeled it after food instead and looked at it more like, is this a lot of sugar or is this a lot of saturated fat? Is this a high salt content or does this have red 40? Like, give me more pieces of information. And so a lot of people will argue that the consumer doesn't care about or understand that information, but we don't give it to them. And we have to give it to them on every single label. Most people don't know the difference between saturated fat and regular fat. They don't need to. The people who do want to have it there. And if everyone sees it all the time, they'll recognize it as something maybe worth Googling later. Like, we've got to meet people where they are, which is that we hand them a package. We got to give them some information. I think that the potency data is better than the sativa hybrid model because at least it's relating to something inside the actual package and not to a conceptual idea that
It's like former genetic lineage.
doesn't
Or,
exist.
yeah. Like,
Right. Yeah. It's like not quite that. It's like the name of the cow when you buy a steak. It's like, okay, but you know, like it's not really helping me make this decision, you know? But, you know, when we don't give customers something else, you
Oh, I
know,
love
we have
that.
to start on our end by at least giving them another data point to start drawing a line,
yeah.
you know, and people will pick the ones they care about.
And people love numbers, as you were saying. Like if we just said medium THC mid, like people are gonna be like, "Where's mid? Like within this range, what is mid?" But especially new cannabis users, and if you are trying to record your cannabis use, and you can say, "I took 5 milligrams of this, and it did this to me," that's probably helpful for new users who are a little tentative to try cannabis.
Right. And it's really easy to add like terpenes and flavonoids to that list of stuff to care about because those are objective numbers that we could put on a label that a consumer could then associate with a subjective experience of how it smelled or tasted to them. And then maybe they would have a reason to trust us and listen to any of the other crazy things that we want to tell them
Yeah.
about.
The nose always knows, and that's why I think it's so nuts that we can't smell flower. Like, and I mean, it
Yeah,
depends on what state. It depends on what state you're in, but like, like,
right. It's a hard problem to solve because allowing people to smell it and just having like the open jars like we used to also, you know, we know was harming it. Like having an open container of pre-rolls is how a lot of these dispensaries are failing their total mold and yeast after the product has hit the shelf. It's because a bud tender reaches in with their bare yeasty hand and you know, or someone smells with their yeast covered face because we are humans and we are filthy. And so it's really hard to give people both, which is why I think looking at it like a food product and, you know, more so than a drug product would make the most sense in terms of like the way that we want to evaluate it. Because people would say the same thing. You want me to buy avocado without giving it a little squeeze? That's
Absurd.
crazy.
Right.
I would not. Like egg cartons have to open because humans don't trust that the eggs aren't broken. It is harder to package and ship them. Like eggs are more expensive because of these openable containers, but people won't buy a carton of eggs that they can't physically open. Like the consumer has proven that they don't trust us, and that's okay. You know, that's fair, I think, in a lot of ways. And so it's really hard to give people both pieces, which is why I think we just give them too much information, just like that nutrition panel on a label. Like you might not know what all of those things do, but if you know they're all there, then at least you have a word to use to start asking a question. At least now you have another data point to add to your own so that it's not just I did a thing and I didn't like it.
That's such a good point about like introducing a keyword in that manner because you know even if you don't know what a flavonoid is, if it's written on a label or on a COA and you now have that word that you can go to Google and say what is a cannabis flavonoid that or cannabis flavonoids, and then maybe that will bring you to a page that is gonna you know educate you to the degree that you're looking for, and that's awesome. I haven't thought about that.
Well, there's some sort of rule. There's like a rule where like it takes a certain amount of exposures.
3 to 5
Okay.
exposures before you even recognize that you've seen a thing. So you'll see someone's logo 3 to 5 times. That's why it's hard for a lot of people to remember names.
Hmm.
Because if I have to hear it and see it and hear it again and see it in writing and say it out loud, like those 3 to 5 exposures, whether they come to you verbally or in writing, depends on what type of learner you are. So if you're like a hands-on kinetic learner, then the reading's never going to reach you. And so like that's how you like will never remember someone's Instagram name, because you see the picture in your mind and not the name next to it. So then it gets real complicated. It's hard to reach people. And then think about if you say in your TikTok video linalool, and someone hears that but they don't see how to write it and spell it, and they try their best in Google. Some of these things are hard for us to say if we know how to say them. And and then it becomes difficult. It's really hard for people to say, what, I didn't understand, can you explain that more. Especially in this environment, people do want to be able to Google it and learn it for themselves. And I mean, must be nice. When I learned all this stuff, it was not on Google the way that it is now. But I think that those key words, because it's the vocabulary gap, right? Like people are still going to ask for sativa and indica and hybrid because it took them until this yesterday to even understand what that meant, only to find out it was wrong. It's a really hard leap.
Hey everybody, it's Andy here. I have to say I agree. It is quite a leap. These barriers that seem to be so important though, I mean it's something that we're passionate about. Our whole team, we're here to communicate these ideas and this information so that hopefully we can make an impact on even just one person out there listening. If you are curious and you want to go out there and give it a shot, you should give it a shot. I'll say one thing. I've learned quite a bit from entering a lab science role with no background. I've traditional background of sales and business development and project management. That's really my background. No lab science background, no experience in labs. Actually, with the exception of demolishing a lab and a construction project years ago. I will say, probably of the many, many things that you can learn in a lab space, the most important thing is to be genuinely curious. Ask questions. Ask a lot of questions. Ask questions about your questions. Ask questions about your answers. Ask questions about how you're asking and answering the questions. I mean, we could go down this road for days. It's just always ask why. Always ask how. Keep going. Fill in the blanks. Ask more questions. Continue. Repeat. That's really what I can say. Being genuinely curious has been the most important piece of my entry-level experience in a lab. And I've learned a lot really quickly, and I've excelled in this space, and I think it's a lot of fun. And I think once you get your hands on this stuff and you move away from the vocabulary words and all this stuff that may be confusing and, oh, I didn't pay attention to that class in high school, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. When you start getting your hands on this stuff, it's no different than anything else. It's like driving a car or making a pizza or mowing a lawn. There's steps, there's protocols, there's safety involved. Times to perform certain duties and times to perform others. And it's really a perspective thing, but be genuinely curious, ask a lot of questions, and maintain a positive attitude, because at any moment you could blow your own mind with what you find out. So get out there and just go for it. That's what we encourage. We want people to learn what they can from these conversations, and hopefully, like I said, hopefully at least one person out there is inspired to get out there and try something new. So without further ado, I do want to take just 1 second to shout out to the industry, shout out to a few groups. We want to thank everybody in the industry that's out there lifting each other up. There are a lot of roadblocks to success in this business, and as this industry is growing and becoming hopefully potentially a federally legal business and mainstream with safe banking and safe access to things in the future, we're on our way. The people out there innovating and changing the game and doing new things and pushing the limits, and the people out there that are doing just the traditional growing the best flower, growing the best product. Most importantly, we should thank the people out there that came before all of us that have sacrificed their freedoms and some even their lives to make sure that people have access to this plant. We appreciate all of you. We are grateful. We do also want to just point out that we have a soft spot in our heart for everyone out there that shares educational content to try to grow this community and teach consumers and teach industry, leaders what's important, why it's important, and why we should continue to ask questions and learn new things. We appreciate all of you, and we especially appreciate our listeners. Thank you guys so much for listening. We're curious, and we hope you are too. We want to continue to have these conversations and talk about all these topics. And please reach out to us. Hit us up on Smokin' All, Instagram, Profound Naturals. You can reach us at Real Isolates on LinkedIn. Ask us questions. Give us ideas. We'd love to hear from a new guest. If you know somebody that you think would be great for the show, let us know. Now, we'll hear a review and a quick word from our company, and we'll get right back to it. Thanks, everyone.
All right. This review is from Lame and Stupid app titled Favorite Podcast. They said, I absolutely love this podcast. The hosts are so thorough and have given me some life-changing information. Miyabi and Riley are changing the game for social media cannabis info. Thanks for sharing your findings, you two.
Thank you so much. We read every review that's left for the podcast. We have a group text going and send these to each other when we see them. And it's really, really motivating for us to know that this information is helping so many of you in your lives. So now we're going to hear a quick word from our company who sponsors this podcast, and then it'll be back to the science.
Most people prefer the effects of smoking over edibles. The most important reason why is heat transformation of cannabinoids, the active ingredients in cannabis. Unlike conventional edibles, edibles made with Smokin' contain heat-transformed cannabinoids from smoke. Edibles made with Smokin' feel more like smoking. If you are a product manufacturer, contact us today. Smokin' we smoked it for you.
And if you're curious about hemp Smokin' we can ship to all the U.S. states from www.profoundnaturals.com.
We currently have tinctures available on the website, and we will soon be releasing various topical products that we have gotten amazing feedback on.
While we are not allowed to say anything about the specific effects of these products, we can say that they are different from anything else out there and that people tell us it really does work better. So to give it a try, head to, again, www.profoundnaturals.com.
And thank you to all of our supporters that have already purchased one. All right, back to the conversation with Murphy. So speaking of chemodiversity and all these different compounds that are found in the cannabis plant, Murphy, would you mind describing what live resin is?
Sure. So anytime the word live is used as an adjective for a product, the reference is to fresh frozen. And fresh frozen implies that at the time of harvest, instead of taking the plant and hanging and drying it, and then, manicuring and curing it, you just are cutting those buds straight off of the stalk, putting them in bags and putting them in the freezer and just freezing it with all of the moisture that it contained at the time of harvest.
So it has all the beneficial compounds still intact. Nothing gets lost during the drying and the curing process. And you just freeze that plant immediately after harvest.
Yep. You freeze it right away. And so it's like 75% water, at least at this point. Like it's mostly water, right? You lose a lot of weight. One thing I love about dealing with fresh frozen is that the buds are still all big and swollen and fat because they were like alive a minute ago. That's why the word live is used. And when they dry, they shrink up and they get a lot smaller. But when I get to look at them, they're like comically large because they haven't lost any of that weight yet. And so from a commercial perspective, just freezing right away saves you like thousands of square feet in just space that you could be growing weed in instead, not to mention not wasting, energy on the, humidity and cooling that's necessary to get the perfect amount of drying, which is how most people ruin their shelf quality cannabis, is that they don't hang and cure it properly because they're trying to do it in these big rooms. So from an extraction perspective, that's a huge bummer, because if you think about extraction starting with like trim, we're getting that plant material in the middle of that process that has been extremely handled by lots of people and is weeks from when that plant was harvested. So a lot has happened to it. And as an extractor, all I can give you is most of what I started with, I can't. So like, give me everything you can is the goal, and freezing it allows me to start with as much as was possibly there with as few touch points as possible. Plant, bag, and it's out of your facility, which also means you get paid faster, because we're talking about 2 months of difference between when you harvest and when you get paid for that. So it's a huge value commercially. Fresh frozen is great for, people who are dealing with like outdoor and things where like you don't want to be selling that material when everyone is selling their material. Freeze it and wait. And once those buds are off of the plant branch, there's no like drying them that's going to be cool for you, like they're a swampy mess from that point forward. So it's very important that it never thaws out again, because again, we're just trying to say, if there was 100 things we could extract at the time of harvest, let's keep it at 100 for as long as we possibly can, and not change containers and not touch it, ideally. So it comes to us, and now we're trying to keep it frozen the rest of the time. And you have 2 extraction methods available to you. One is to just use more water, and that's your ice water bubble hash method. And you just put it right back in that water that it knows, keeping it cold the whole time. And the mechanical agitation separates that resin from the plant material.
Mechanical agitation is just a fancy way for saying shaking it up. You shake it all up. You shake all of it up in the ice water, and you're literally mechanically or physically shaking off those trichomes.
And so that's still a live extraction, because we're still going fresh frozen, and then we're collecting that resin, separating the plant material away from it. People will often refer to their rosin as like live rosin, which implies that they were using fresh frozen in that water hash method, because you can do dry material too. But the fresh frozen is preferred. And a lot of that does for sure come from the commercial value,
And just quickly before you move on, you've been in the industry for a while. So were these live products like even a thing 8 years ago?
Yeah. So fresh frozen was kind of almost always a thing for the bubble hash, but they didn't market it as live. We were just doing it that way because it worked well,
Right. And it just created a really great product.
Exactly. What changed significantly, especially once recreational manufacturing hit, is that, that ice and water extraction method, it's mechanical agitation. There's maybe, if you're fancy, you've got some pumps, you maybe have, an ice maker yourself, like there's a walk-in cooler, a walk-in freezer, there's an investment in overhead, but it's pretty low to get in. But once recreational hit and we all got money, which is more recent in the history of cannabis, butane and propane extraction got huge. And the reason that it got bigger then is that it's more expensive to build out a safe and compliant facility, and that equipment is more expensive up front. But butane and propane is the only other solvent extraction method that you have to choose from if you want to deal with fresh frozen, because all of the other solvents can't play with water. And so butane and propane are refrigerants, they're freezing. So in order to keep them liquid, you can just get them cold. And anytime they're in motion, they get colder. And so you don't have to invest as much energy, and they inherently get colder when they do the thing you want them to, which is the opposite of CO2. If I'm trying to keep CO2 a liquid, I have to go in that hot direction. And so butane and propane evaporate easily. They're already food grade. They are refrigerants, so they stay cold. They're hydrophilic. They don't want to absorb that water. They're not going to take on those water soluble compounds. They actually keep the material frozen, just the faster that it goes through. So it's like perfect. It's this perfect secret ingredient for cannabis extraction, because they're very well suited for your terpene extraction. They can do a lot of the things that CO2 can do, except cold.
These solvents we're talking about, CO2, ethanol, propane, butane, are all organic solvents. So they are carbon-based, and they're good at extracting organic compounds, like those found in cannabis. But the small differences, such as how attracted they are to water or how easily they evaporate, makes a huge difference when considering extraction efficiency, shelf life, selectivity, and other important factors.
And that is where the live branding really came from, because everyone else could make material, you know, from using dry material, make it cheaper, make more of it. If you're running this fresh frozen material, it's more weight going in, less weight coming out. And so the market was used to dry material product. And this live sticky terpy product was not popular yet. People didn't know what to do with it. You could touch shatter with your hand. You could touch wax with your hand before, you know, it was a different consistency. And then people brought out this live resin and you couldn't touch it anymore. And it was kind of not well received at first. And so that's where the live branding finally came out, is that we had to justify why it was wetter.
Yeah, we know about introducing new things are difficult. I mean, it's because when it's new,
They will kill the messenger.
when it's new, it's new, and you know, like we gotta tell
Makes
people.
it scary and bad inherently. You have to work through that. Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because I'm just gonna nerd out for a second about the butane propane like versus CO2. I think that the chemistry behind that working is just such a magical, just like
It's
a
like,
magical
it's a
occurrence.
secret. Nobody ever expected it, I don't think.
I mean, before there was funding to be able to do some of these things, like these are all just theoreticals because no one had the ability to, you know, to look at it ourselves. And that is something that I am grateful for. Like I'm so grateful that we can be, the three of us are here talking about cannabis research, and that, you know, this is something that I didn't picture for myself, but that if I could have when I was younger, I probably would have been a lot happier knowing that this is something that's coming in the future, because this is really, really cool. And being able to look into, you know, different products, like creating new products or improving existing products that were there, like giving more options to people, like those are things that we're super passionate about. And that I think the means to be able to do that in the context of a laboratory setting, like what you're talking about, like you working with butane and propane can be dangerous. So you have to have the right room build out. You have to have the right like ventilation. You have to have the right protection equipment and everything. So for everyone listening, like don't do this at home. Like we're talking about doing it in lab
It's the
settings.
best. Don't do it. Right. Yeah. Try out the water hash. Everyone should do that. That's easy to do. You can do it at home. You can do a small batch. You can get like these cute little 1 gallon bags. You could do it a jar at a time. I promise you. If you grow one plant, you could make a couple grams, a little teeny bit of hash, and it would be super fun. I would encourage everyone to do that. But butane and propane did require a little bit of maturity from the industry for it to grow up. And that's not to say that people weren't doing it before. We were just doing scary things that we also can't recommend that you do because we didn't know better. We knew that it worked and we had to grow up a little bit to be able to scale it safely. And as soon as we did, it just became the standard, you know?
So, we're talking about butane and propane as these solvents that are dangerous to the lab technician, but I think a lot of consumers also are very scared of these terms because, you know, we associate it with other things in our lives where we see butane and propane and we think, oh my gosh, that's very frightening to be in a product. But for anyone listening, I mean, can you describe how you get those solvents out of the product and how you ensure those solvents are not in the product that is going to consumers? Because we know that they're used to extract the molecules, but it doesn't mean that the consumer is actually taking in a significant amount of them.
Right. So butane and propane are extremely volatile solvents. That's what makes them so dangerous, is that their ability to go from liquid to gas is incredibly fast. There's not reaction time for you. And then they're combustible when that happens as well. And so they evaporate at very low temperatures. Propane's going to evaporate at -46. Butane's going to evaporate at like 38 degrees, you know? So like it's evaporating. You can't hold on to it. And so the only reason that it stays in your cannabis oil is surface tension. If the oil is very dense, it can't get out, but it does not want to be there. So if it's left behind, just the nature of dabbing is going to evaporate that butane very quickly. And you know, if you light a joint with a big lighter, you're exposing yourself to several thousand ppms of butane every time you do that. So none of this is to say that like having residual butane in it is good or bad. I know that'd be a really nice category for people to have, but it's always about the dose. Everything is. Don't inhale too long and light your joint for too long. Ease up on it. Everything in moderation. Same thing with the extracts. So the consumer doesn't have much to worry about for trace amounts, but on the operator end, on the technician end, the people who are handling this material, those are very low boiling points. You can get it out. So whether it's good or bad, doesn't matter. Don't be lazy. It's very easy to evaporate. You are not going to get an easier solvent to evaporate than something that evaporates at 38 Fahrenheit. Like, congratulations,
Because it's so easy to evaporate, you're also maintaining the integrity of your product as well. You're not
Right.
destroying the
Very
compounds.
few other things are
Right.
evaporating at that same temperature. So you get to evaporate it at low temperatures. It's still heat if you're butane or propane, but it's not heat that's going to impact your terpenes. And so that's why most of the methods of extraction that you saw from butane and propane were surface area oriented. We didn't know that. We didn't even have residual solvent testing when we're doing this. But when you think about a big slab of shatter, the reason that that worked well is because if you spread all of that oil out real flat and get it hot, you can evaporate the solvent out really easily. Kind of an annoying method, not my favorite one anymore, but we didn't know any better. It took us a while before we started buying rotary evaporators. It took us a while before we learned about tools that could make it easier. From shatter, we started seeing like wax and butter. And so it was the same thing, but we were whipping it and aerating it. And so that agitation was, again, just breaking the surface tension. And if you agitated it enough, the solvent would evaporate. And so a lot of the textures that we originally sold from butane and propane extraction were possible based on trying to evaporate that solvent, because it would start liquid and then solidify when it was all evaporated out. But a lot of those methods, like spreading it super thin or whipping it up in open air on heat, did impact our terpenes, because if you do just pull deep vacuum on it, you're still going to suck your terpenes out, even if you only do it at room temperature, so a lot of those methods were solvent oriented and texture oriented. We didn't think about terpenes yet. And that's because we were dealing with a lot of the times dry material that didn't have great terpenes, wasn't even strain specific, probably in the first place. We were calling it hybrid shatter, sativa shatter, silly things that didn't give the consumer a lot of information, but they were still really high potency because it's just a whole bunch of THCA. So great.
And like one more thing just about the safety of using these butane propane extracts is you mentioned that it really doesn't like water. It doesn't want to capture water. Whereas like CO2 methods, ethanol, something like that does like water. There's an affinity there and you will capture some water. So for the consumer, we talked about with one of our previous guests about the water content in the final product and how it could grow mold. And so with these hydrocarbon extractions, is there usually much less of a chance of your product growing mold and going bad on the shelves at the dispensary?
Yeah, you have pretty much, I don't want to say zero because there's no such thing as zero, but the butane and propane is not a compatible solvent to even extract the mold because the mold would feed on that hydrocarbon. So it's not even going to dissolve that surface area where that mold exists very well. A lot of people will take that sentence and in their minds go right to, I could remediate mold with it. Just don't, let's not have moldy cannabis. But what it means is that it's just not an environment where there's anything that's like biologically alive enough for that to start growing. It's inherently sterile in that way because it's extremely volatile with that gas in there and those terpenes and then now solid cannabinoids. Like what's anything gonna do? It's very hard to get moisture content in there, and that moisture content isn't very compatible with it. So it's also much easier to separate. So not only do you have less steps because you don't have to worry about water, the solvent evaporates very easily. So you can get to zero non-detectable limits very easily without jeopardizing the rest of the product. And that became really important with live resin because we finally saw terpene content that was raging. And, it's because we just start with more. So from that, chemodiversity perspective, if all of the extremely volatile terpenes evaporate in the drying process, then none of the dried product has them.
Right. One thing I want to point out that you've been talking about, just talking about the safety and how residual solvents are tested for, but just the relative safety about using butane and propane and about hitting a bowl. I think all of us have been at some point in our lives at the end just trying to hit a bowl, like an empty bowl. And we're I'm not recommending that you do that. I'm just saying that that is way more butane
Yeah. I mean,
than
if we want to have a controversial discussion, I think it's quite possible that the terpenes that you're dabbing would be potentially more harmful than the butane if there was some left in it in a lot of these products. And that's just by, again, the dosage. 5% myrcene in a dab. I don't know. I don't know if you should do that.
Nobody knows.
we literally
Nobody
don't
knows.
know. Yeah,
Yeah.
like we're like
I don't
and
no comment, like I can't.
well, and that's an interesting point that you bring up about like the unknown and about like I think that like I understand what you say by saying it's controversial, but it's also just the truth that we don't know
Truth is controversial.
everything.
Yeah.
And that's just the truth is controversial, and that we like to, and again, you said this earlier too, humans like to have boxes of like good, bad, this is good, this is bad, and with cannabis there's like we are in an infinite gray area here, and we are all like exploring it, and I think that that's really really exciting. But we're not fear mongering and trying to say that anything necessarily is bad. What we are saying is that there actually isn't any research on individual or combined levels of terpenes, rare cannabinoids. We don't have a lot of it yet because it was difficult and illegal, and it still is illegal to research. And there's a high barrier to entry for that type of research. And so, realistically, I don't know if we're gonna get the research for the infinite number of combinations that you could see
Well,
that are
right.
present in the plant.
What we'll get is exactly what consumers ask for. Because if people will continue to buy it without that data, then we are the only ones who care.
That's a great point.
Shoot, and then it's just up to people liking our ideas, and plenty of people do, and we'll just have to thrive on our own passion, and and it'll be like every other research industry, probably kind of poor,
Yeah,
and slow.
and it's such a good point. Just like that's not the research that's going to happen. Like most researchers aren't going to hook up like a dab rig and then use a pure terpene or a pure cannabinoid to study exactly how that compound breaks down at a specific temperature. Because then what? Then we have to study the breakdown products and how those interact with the human body, and that's already $1 million project, and that's just one terpene.
Well, and back to specializing, like we talked about earlier, if you do that and you say, here's the experiment, here's what I did, here's what happened, now people will accept that information and immediately say to you, okay, so how does that affect me? Is that good or bad for me? And you don't have that answer. That's someone else's job now, So like we all have to be able to again work together about what we care about. And if the consumer doesn't care as much as we do, then we won't see it happen. Like that's why tobacco went as far as it did without any research, is that people had to get hurt first to care. We can avoid that with cannabis. And I think it's important to try, because we have seen other products marketed as healthy and beneficial that weren't. And I'm not saying we're wrong about cannabis, but we have been wrong about things. So we have to be, paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, science is a constant evolution. That's like we're on a journey together. All of us are, learning as we go, everyone. And that's true for every scientific field, but specifically for cannabis, like there is a huge wealth of information out there in people. And that's one value that I've gotten from, actually engaging with consumers and like, through social media and through educating and talking to people who use cannabis. Like there's a disconnect here between like science and academia and the everyday consumer, and like the research has this giant like gap in between. And I think the goal eventually would be to kind of like build a closer bridge or bridge that gap so that there's a little bit more consumer driven research. Actually, this is something that is difficult. Even if you were, I'm just going to speak in the theoretical here. If Riley and I were theoretically to have a paper that we were theoretically trying to get published in a theoretical peer review that was driven by consumer data and driven by, say, social media data, um, theoretically it could be difficult to publish that research because some scientific journals, many of them don't view the consumer like demand and or like the consumer wants as a valid reason for pursuing a scientific exploration. And so there's all these roadblocks that are kind of like the cannabis industry is like coming up against as we're trying to be something kind of new, really, like, and it's exciting. But
Well, and it's also so difficult because cannabis is such a subjective experience. Everyone, depending on the product, depending on your body, depending on where you bought it, everything is going to influence how you feel after using that product. So I think with traditional research methodologies, we're kind of taught to be objective, to say things like only that we're 100% confident for because we controlled all the variables we possibly could. That is straight up impossible when dealing with cannabis in humans. There are far too many variables to even try to control most of them. So we're trying to publish some data that's relevant to consumers that we collected from consumers, and it's just not as cut and dry as traditional academia is used to seeing. And that's where we're kind of struggling with the publication process. And even if the consumer perspective was appreciated, science is not written in a way that's consumer friendly. It's a lot of jargon and often written in a way that's targeted towards other academic researchers, not towards consumers.
Well, I feel like that's a great segue for me to talk about Hash Fight because I see that same issue, which is that if I do read an academic paper about cannabis, it is almost always without the context of how it applies to cannabis. And I have to bring that to the experience, right? One thing I always will recommend to people is that whoever the author is of that paper, send them an email, like email that person, find them on LinkedIn, and just people would love to talk to you about the paper that they wrote. If you read it, people would love that, and like reach out to them and ask for more context. Because a lot of it is very interesting, but without context is hard to apply, So like when that paper came out about the COVID-19 experience with cannabinoids, like the leaps that people make from a piece of information to how to apply it are infinite because they don't exist within the context of that peer-reviewed paper. The peer-reviewed paper is, here is a thing that I thought and did and measured, and the end, like it's intentionally anticlimactic. Whereas people would like there to be like a choreographed dance that they kind of know what's going to happen at the end. Like they want this predictable experience that tells them why this information matters. And so Hash Fight is, this kind of pseudo competitive experience where the format is the scientific method. We want to answer questions about cannabis from every angle of the industry, but the way that we're going to deliver that information is visual and in a competitive format, in this reality TV kind of format, so that people have the context for why it matters. So like you said, you hook up a dab rig and you attach it to see that when you smoke it, what's coming out of it. I hooked up a UV detector to a dab rig so that we then smoked it, so that we could see the potency and the decarboxylation and be able to math backwards how much of our THC is still on the Q-tip after we dabbed versus what we were able to bring in. We've got to bring it back to the consumer. It matters what gets inhaled by this complicated scientific equipment because you're the complicated scientific equipment. It's you, you're the one who has to be that test subject later. And so the idea behind Hash Fight is kind of, a summary of everything we talked about today, which is that we have good questions. We can test them out. We have the resources to get access to equipment, get access to material, get access to different hash, and then get access to the public. So first we do an experiment and we make a product, and next everybody smokes it, everybody eats it, everybody tries it, because all data is data. So if you like it or not, period, yes or no,
That's like
it's
the
still
most
data.
relevant data.
Yeah.
It's like the best
Yeah.
data.
Right.
Do people enjoy this experience? Yes or
It
no?
is.
Was it good?
Is. Right. And it's really important for us to figure out, because it gives us the direction that we need to then say, okay, people love live resin. People are going to be producing with butane and propane more. So we need to spend more money on figuring out how to safely manufacture it and safely build infrastructure around it. Whereas, we see things like CO2 phasing themselves out a lot in the recreational market. And now we don't have to spend, like there's now great minds in our industry are able to, come and work on something else that people care about. Like, it's really great for us to be able to pivot when we listen to the consumers. But it is about giving them the context. And if people don't understand it, that's not the end of it. We have to give them a reason to understand. And so maybe that means that we're making silly jokes. Maybe that means that we just literally make them dab rosin and, live resin extracted from the same plant, and just say, like, for real, is it different? Are you, having a different experience from one versus the other? And then take that same live resin and that same rosin and put it in an edible and say, are you getting a different experience from one or the other? Like, even if we have to bring it to one person at a time, that's fine. We'll hash fight everybody individually.
Is Hash Fight, is it like a video series that people can watch, or is this just like a bunch of people getting together doing this? Like, can I watch Hash Fight?
Yes, so it's both. So
I tried.
So we film, so YouTube kicks us off. YouTube does not.
Yeah, that's when I
thing.
tried to watch it.
That's
like,
a problem. Yeah, so we're working on that because we have to be able to host it elsewhere. They don't like what we're into. But super soon, hashfight.com will have it live, and we'll be able to move everything off of that. But we film everything we do. And so again, it's the scientific method. We start out with like, are we going to get a higher yield doing hand wash bubble hash with like a stick in a trash can versus like a commercial washer? And we do it and we see if we get a higher yield or not. And then we test it and see if one's more potent or not. And then we smoke it and see if one tastes different or not. And all of that data goes into the video. And also all of that data goes into the, the scientific, our paper that we write. And so my paper is mostly like stick figure drawings, a lot of icons, a lot of symbols, because I want to bring it to like the level that people care about. And then if you do want to see more, click it, because I did a heavy metal test on the water. It was upsetting, like I'm looking at all of that other stuff, but someone else, it doesn't need that information. The water's not in the hash. The water was a waste product. I'm now thinking about what's going into the rivers and the seas. I can't have that conversation at the same time that I'm trying to say, which kind of hash do you like better, the one made in a trash can or a washer? We have to kind of take a piece at a time. But so it's this collaborative effort to test everything, to just test everything, throw all of that data in there.
You're saving people so much time who have to do these experiments by themselves in every individual lab. And Miyabi and I were just talking about having some issues with peer review. One of the things we were thinking of is publishing starting a journal where it's called like Practical Applications in Cannabis Science, where it's just stuff to help other people in the cannabis space that doesn't need to be as sophisticated as traditional peer review, but just helpful information, which it sounds like you're doing, which is amazing.
And I love the accessibility of it, because that's something that we talk about all the time, and that this is why we have this podcast. We want to make this accessible. This information should be relevant to people who are using these products.
Yeah, everyone does care about it. They just think we're nerds. Like, we got to figure out how to get it to them. And so, the competitive angle is fun because we call it a competition, but really, if I do the experiment and I get a result and the experiment goes online, now you do that experiment.
I love it.
And if you repeat it and we film it, that's peer reviewed. And we call peer reviewed pretty entertaining reviews. Um, so, so we're just looking at it like, can we all get these results? Can we all repeat this experience? Is this an outlier that's just happening to one person, or is this information that does apply universally? And so some of that is based on like which lighter lasts longer. And then that turns into which lighter actually emits more butane when you inhale from it. And then, and it can go into all of these different areas, and it's all just pieces to help give people context, because a lot of these ideas are big. And a lot of us that care about them are easily distracted. So we have to like compact it. And that's where I think it's good that the short attention span of the internet does limit us, because it forces me to say one thing, just get it out, instead of the whole paper that now requires like a lot of investment on behalf of the reader to figure out if they care or not.
And a high barrier to entry. Like, this is like, but okay, we are going to have a way longer conversation again to follow up about this, because there's a million things that we are thinking. Like, I know
we
Riley's
need to have some hash fights right away. Like, yes, we need to have some smoked versus live.
Oh yeah.
Immediately.
Also, just like
this is important. Yeah.
The fact that you're having other people repeat that is already more rigorous than most science, because 60% of peer-reviewed publications is not
That's
repeatable.
Why it's competitive. Yeah, right. That's why it's competitive, is because people don't care unless it affects them. But if they can win.
Right, totally.
Because the point is to beat me, right? Like if you can repeat the experiment, then inherently you should do it better than me. Every single person that takes in all of that information should do it better. And I love that. One of the first people that we did a wash fight with against their equipment is a local company here called Low Temp Plates. And since that wash fight, they integrated a live run log on their website based on the data points we collected. And so now anyone who has a washer can get an account that says like, that they are verified, they own a washer, and they can add their data to see what their run times and what their yields are. So we're just able to collect this open source data. And so maybe it's not verified, maybe it's not like academic peer reviewed research, but that just means we need more. Anecdotal data is just as good. You just need like a million more inputs for it to average out correctly, but it will. And so that's the idea, is like, if we just get the information from the people, we'll be able to hopefully, figure out what to pay attention to, or how to get them to pay attention to what we think is important. But it's, so far in my experience, people do care. There just is a lot of mistrust in between each category. The people from academia mistrust the people from the industry because they mistrust each other. And the consumer is like, y'all don't get along. Why am I, I don't trust either of you. This is expensive. That's all,
No
yeah.
So
trust no one, test everything. And that's it. And that's the concept. And at its core, it's not about being right. It's about, at least answering one question so that we can get on to the next
1,500. Well, this has been so amazing. Thank you for coming on. And just one last thing. We're just letting people chat about like anything you want to share with our listeners. So the floor is yours.
I think it's always a good idea to take the time to prop up and say, support labs that invest in analytics. People who are investing in analytics are the type of labs that you want to, support and buy their products, because they're people who care about quality. And, there's nothing that people could do that has more impact on the industry than choosing who they spend their money with. It is really, really important. And so, the most impact you can have in getting better quality cannabis is to make sure that you reach out and find suppliers that you trust, and people that test, and people who care about that. That being said, I invest a lot of my time and my lab's time in analytical testing. So I would also encourage you all to check out my lab, Sano Gardens. You can find us on Instagram. We make live resin, specifically. Just extracting from fresh frozen. We also use a chromatography process on that to be able to extract and purify that product as much as possible, which also gives us the ability to create ingredients that feed a couple of other important brands like Teeny Tiny Science, which is a nano emulsion product where we're able to emulsify things like rosin, things like live resin, as well as distillate, and start giving people these different options for both chemical profile and bioavailability. So whether you want to dab or whether you want to drink it or eat it or whatever else, we're here for the science. So find us on Instagram and follow our brands. And you can also find me on Instagram, Murphy Murri. I post about all the weird stuff that I'm doing, and follow Hashbite as well.
And we'll link all those in the description so people can just copy paste or whatever's easiest. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, please give us a shout out on Instagram at Smoke and All. Or if you're a licensed processor who is interested in working with us, please shoot us an email at sales@smokeandall.com.
Last reminder that we sell hemp smoke and all tinctures and soon to be topicals at www.profoundnaturals.com. The listeners of this podcast are the types of people that we are making these products for.
We talk a lot about our products on this podcast, but this podcast is sponsored by Smoke and All, and every purchase that you make goes directly towards making more educational content for you guys. And we seriously believe it is making a difference in people's lives. So thank you so much.
If you want to support us, please share this podcast with any friends, family, or even your local dispensaries. It would really help us. Or you could review us wherever you listen to the podcast. If you already have, thank you so much. Extra special thanks to Telfrc, John Van Dyke, Tabs24, Gersan, Someone from New Zealand, Surgeoneer, C5X2C, Cool Bean King, Sync1, James T84, Airbender Andy, CK Dascam, Pimental Portfolio, Maya1722, La Playa 34, Beth in New Hampshire, Tony Rome, CJ Sloan, Old Geek 1, QD 1994, John the Bow, Abso Fruitly, Felly Cab, Samsonite 55, Mr. Clean, LJM 420, and Layman Stupid App. They're our favorite sesh members who never drop the grinder on the floor and then have to spend forever trying to pick it up or do the nylon and the vacuum thing.
Mad love, friends. Thank you for your support. We will see you at the next Smokin' Science sesh.